All right, guys, so the next topic in this unit is monopolistic competition. Good news, it's super similar to perfect competition and monopoly. In fact, it's kind of just a combo of the two that a lot of the topics I go over today, we already covered. And the graphs, it's going to be a combination of the two as well. So there's not a lot of new information other than knowing what this industry is. This one and the next one we're going to do, oligopoly, are going to be the two markets that are considered imperfectly competitive. So the perfect competition is one extreme. The monopoly is the other extreme. These are the two in the middle. So they're the ones we're going to be covering last, but know them as imperfect competition. The one today, monopolistic competition, has a ton of firms selling products that are similar but not identical. Oligopoly, what I'll do next, is when there's a few large, powerful firms that dominate the industry. So this one, as I mentioned, there are many sellers, similar to perfect competition. But what's different than perfect competition is there's slight product differences, and those differences they capitalize on to try and separate them from their competitors. But like perfect competition, there's relatively easy entry and exit from the market. And remember how important that was with perfect competition because it affects the long run and what happens to prices in the long run. We're gonna see a similar relationship in monopolistic competition. So that product differentiation, let me go into a little bit more. It's what separates monopolistic from perfect competition, because in perfect, those identical products, since there was no difference, they had to charge the same exact price. But now, since there are product differences, you see brands charging different prices based on what they offer. And retail is an excellent example of monopolistic competition, because think of like jeans. You can buy jeans from over 100 different places, and they're essentially denim pants, but those slight product differences, cut, style, brand, all of these separate them from each other, and that's why you notice some differences in price. And because of those differences in price, like a monopoly, there's going to be a downward sloping demand curve versus in perfect competition where it was a horizontal demand curve equal to price. That advertising part is huge. This is what they use as a primary tool to separate them from their competitors. So you're going to see firms in monopolistically competitive industries really push their brand, their style, their fit to try and get you in their door as opposed to their similar but not identical competitors' doors. So as I said, the demand curve is different. So it's going to end up being similar to a monopoly, just a little bit more elastic. And even when you draw it, you may not notice that it's a little bit more horizontal, but you do need to take note of that it's a little bit more elastic than a monopoly demand curve. And with that, there's no unit elastic, inelastic, elastic portion. It's not a linear demand curve. It's just one downward sloping demand curve. And this is, again, what separates it from perfect competition, because this shows different prices affecting consumers' willingness to buy. And like monopoly, we have a separate marginal revenue curve. So exact same thing as I talked about with the monopoly. It'll be below the demand curve, because as we buy a larger quantity, we're not only having to pay less at the larger quantity, but at all the previous prices as well, like I covered in the monopoly notes. So the setup is going to look extremely similar to a monopoly graph. Downward sloping demand curve, downward sloping marginal revenue line below the demand curve. So here it is. And that should be very, very similar. A lot of times in monopolistic competition, they don't have marginal revenue going all the way past negative. I have seen it before, but you don't have to, because you're not measuring whether or not it's in the elastic or inelastic portion on a monopolistically competitive firm. So because of that, you can draw it with them both being above or marginal revenue going negative, but essentially the same exact setup as a monopoly. So here is our basic graph. We still have the ATC and the MC like we did in perfect competition and monopoly. Downward sloping demand curve. I drew it here a little bit more elastic because, as I said, it's more elastic than in a monopoly. And you still measure the profit maximizing quantity and the price that's going to be charged, just like we did in a monopoly. Profit maximizing quantity is still where MR equals MC. So right here. So this is the quantity that they're going to charge in a monopolistically competitive firm. To determine the price, you, just like in a monopoly, take that point and go up to where it hits the demand line. Because again, that represents the max price consumers are willing to pay for that quantity. And so the setup for price and profit maximizing quantity ends up being exactly the same as a monopoly, and how you measure profit ends up being the same as well. Look at the price you're charging, so where it hits the demand line, and compare it to ATC and go over. So the profit shading is exactly like we did in a monopoly. So convenient. Same for a loss. So now here, profit maximizing quantity, where MR and MC intersect. Draw that up to where it hits the demand line. That is the price the monopolist is going to charge. Then up to where ATC is represents the loss monopolistically competitive firms are going to be making. Much more likely to see losses in monopolistic competition than in a monopoly. Remember, the monopoly graph almost always is in a profit. Not all the time, but most of the time. Monopolistically competitive, like perfect competition, they could be making short-run profits and short-run losses, but it'll end up being driven, just like in perfect competition, to a long-run equilibrium point. So in the short run, it's extremely similar to a monopoly. You measure price the same way, profit and loss the same way, and profit maximizing quantity the same way. But what's different from a monopoly is that free entry and exit that perfect competition had. So this is going to do something similar to perfect competition. But the good news is you don't have to draw the two side-by-side graphs. You do not have to draw the market and the firm's graph like in perfect competition. We're still just going to keep that one firm graph. But we need to think about on that one firm's graph how firms entering and exiting the market will affect that graph. It ends up having the same conclusion as perfect competition, but it ends up looking different. And the reason why, although its entry and exit is a little bit different with perfect competition and monopolistic competition, but what's the same is economics profits are driven to zero in monopolistic competition and perfect competition. So how it works, they can enter and exit the market with relatively low restrictions, and instead of it being like the supply and demand for the market, we're going to look at how when firms exit and enter into the market, how that affects the demand on the firm's line. So in the short run, if firms hear that they can make a profit, they're going to enter into the industry, exact same as perfect competition. What this does, though, on the firm's graph is the demand line on the firm's graph is going to fall. Because if more firms enter into the industry, then people have more options. And if people have more options to buy from other firms, they don't necessarily need it from that one individual firm that we're graphing. So again, firms enter into the market, the demand for that one individual firm falls, which we measure price where it hits the demand line, causes prices to fall as well. And if prices fall, that means we're driving the price down from profit to that long-run equilibrium point. So the demand for the firms that were already in the market before entering in, their demand will fall when more firms enter into the market, driving the price down. If firms are making a loss in monopolistic competition, same as perfect, firms will exit, and the firms that are left over will have more people buying their products because now there's less choices of whom to buy it from. So if more people are buying their product, the demand for the firm who's left in the industry who didn't exit increase. And if it increases and you determine price on where it hits the demand line, then the price will go up, causing us to move from being in a loss to breaking even. So that same idea is perfect competition, just a little bit different on how it looks on the graph. But firms entering and exiting an industry drives the price up or down to where you end up at the point where in the long run, you're at normal profit. So zero economic profit, but positive accounting profit. So that point where you're breaking even and have no incentive to leave the industry and go somewhere else. So that's that long run equilibrium, just like in perfect competition, being driven to that point of normal profit. This is how it looks on the graph. You see we have now firms entering and exiting, and you don't have to draw the demand increasing and decreasing, but what ends up happening is the ATC ends up becoming tangent to the demand curve, showing that this firm is not making a profit or loss, they're breaking even. Kind of awkward, and pretty awkward to draw too. One of the reasons why it's awkward is because it's not intersecting at the minimum of the ATC like it did in perfect competition. It's intersecting on the left-hand side of it, on the economics of of scale portion, and it's intersecting there. And that's important. It can't intersect at the minimum because it's not perfect competition. It's not going to be at that perfectly efficient point. But they're breaking even. So because of that, there's not a huge incentive to regulate this industry, because if they regulated the price, firms would keep going out of business. They're not making economic profits in the long run. Two terms that go with monopolistic competition, and you technically could use this for monopoly as well because their prices are too high and their quantities too low, but you see it almost always with monopolistic competition. What's separating it from perfect competition? The first thing is the quantity, and the term we use to describe the criticism between the quantity in perfect competition and the quantity in monopolistic competition is excess capacity. So it's the difference where our quantity would be in perfect competition and where our quantity is in monopolistic competition. So here it is on the graph. We have where the quantity we would be charging here in a normal, perfectly competitive firm, and the quantity we're charging here. Because there's a downward sloping separate marginal revenue line from the price, like it was in perfect competition, the quantity ends up being less than it was in perfect competition, showing the quantity we're producing is less than the efficient scale that we would be producing in perfect competition. And that criticism, that difference between where we are and where we want to be, is excess capacity. The other criticism is markup cost. So markup cost is dealing with the price being too high. In perfect competition, our price is equal to marginal cost, but not in monopolistic competition, which monopolistic competition will notice, because price is not equal to average total cost and is not equal to marginal cost, is neither productive nor allocatively efficient, even in the long run. So it is an inefficient, imperfect marketplace. So with the price being above the marginal cost, that difference between where we are producing at the higher price and where we want to be in perfect competition is markup cost. So here it is in perfect competition, and here it is in monopolistic competition. This is the price that we want to charge to be efficient. This is where we're charging it because we have a separate demand line, and that difference is markup. So note on your graphs when you're drawing perfect monopolistic competition, I have this on your homework, where the excess capacity and markup cost are, because those are commonly asked FRQ questions on the AP exam. Here's both of them on one graph so you can see them together. Quantity is too low, price is too high, it has excess capacity and markup cost, even though this firm is in long run equilibrium. So with that, if we have this problem of producing below the efficient scale, we're going to have deadweight loss, just like in a monopoly. Good news, you measure it just like you did in monopoly as well. You go up along the marginal cost from where you're producing to where you want to be producing, up to here, and that shaded area is your deadweight loss. But as I mentioned before, so when we're in long-run equilibrium, the firm's not making any economic profit. So there's not a huge incentive, even though there is markup cost, to regulate a monopolistically competitive firm. So we usually let them exist at that break-even point. Two externalities that go with this. Not something you'll have to graph. You don't have to separate the supply, social and private costs, etc., but you do need to know the definitions. One externality is the product variety externality. This would be how more firms entering is a positive externality for the consumer. Because for us, when more firms enter into the industry, we have more variety of different places we can buy our product from. The negative externality, it's from the same concept, but from the producer's perspective, the business stealing externality. So more firms entering into the industry, although is nice for the consumer and maybe a positive externality for the consumer, is a negative externality for the producer, because that's stealing their business away and decreasing their demand and lowering the price they're selling at. So firms entering into the market for monopolistically competitive markets don't like it, but there's not a whole lot they can do about it because there's free market entry and exit in monopolistic competition. And that is all of the notes for monopolistic competition. I will see you guys later. Have a wonderful day.